My name is Kevin Kenny. I teach the history of American immigration here at Boston College. And it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague from history, Professor Jim O'Toole, the CLUE Millennium Chair in History at BC. And Jim will be talking to us today about Boston College and the immigrant experience, the first 150 years. No other individual knows more about the history of Boston College than Jim O'Toole. He's currently completing the official history of the university, which will appear as part of the sesquicentennial celebration. Jim was trained as an archivist as well as a historian before taking up his first faculty position at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. He was assistant curator of manuscripts and rare books at the New England Historic Genealogical Society. He served as deputy and acting state archivist in the Archives of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and he was the first professional archivist for the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Boston. Jim O'Toole joined the history department here at BC in 1998. He teaches courses on American religious history, on Catholic history, and on the history of Boston. And his research interests lie in the history of religious practice and popular devotion. In his first book, Militant and Triumphant, William Henry O'Connell and the Catholic Church in Boston, Professor O'Toole reinterpreted the career of a towering figure in the Catholic hierarchy in the first half of the 20th century. In a second book, Passing for White, Race, Religion, and the Healy Family, he told the remarkable story of how one Catholic family of mixed Irish and African origin negotiated the terrain of race and ethnicity in 19th century Boston. In his most recent book, The Faithful, The History of Catholics in America, Professor O'Toole offered a bold and panoramic history of American Catholicism from colonial times to the present, told from the perspective of the laity. In addition to his research in American religious history, Professor O'Toole has been working for the past several years, as I mentioned, on a new history of Boston College. So we're very fortunate to have Jim with us today to say a few relatively brief words. He'll speak for 20 minutes and we'll be very happy to take questions, open up a conversation. His topic is immigration in the past, present, and future of our university. So please join me in welcoming Jim O'Toole.
Thank you, Kevin, for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I'm probably the 17th person to welcome you to Boston College as a part of this conference. I have no authority to do that, but I do it anyway. This conference, I think, is a particularly suitable and appropriate way for us to mark the 150th anniversary of the founding of this university. This is indeed our sesquicentennial year, and in fact this year is a double anniversary for us, 150 years of the founding of the school and 100 years on this Chestnut Hill campus. So it's a particularly celebratory occasion. What I'd like to do is tell you something briefly about the history of this institution with particular reference to the immigrant experience as it has been played out here. At our founding and in the early years, recent immigrants and their families were at the very heart of what Boston College was and what it intended to be. Most of the students, and interestingly, most of the faculty in the very early years were either immigrants themselves or were only a single generation removed from the immigrant experience. The school was clearly intended to serve them, to help them advance their fortunes and those of their families over the succession of generations. Richard Rodriguez said last night that immigrant hopes are always not so much for themselves, but for the children, for the next generation. And I think our school has been an example of that. Now, a century and a half after our founding, immigrants are still a part of our story, not as visibly, perhaps, as they were at the outset, but still very much a part of who we are as a university. If you were at the naturalization ceremony yesterday afternoon, very impressive and I must say moving ceremony. We saw one of our own current students, an immigrant, taking the naturalization oath along with 93 others, showing, I think, that we are still a place for immigrants. And it's for that reason that I think of this talk as a description of only the first 150 years of immigration at Boston College, an experience that can and will and should continue. So let me give you the outlines of this story, first by painting in two contexts. First is the context of immigration in Boston, and the second is the context of Jesuit education in the United States. Context number one, immigration to Boston, especially in the middle of the 19th century. This is a story that's familiar to many of you. It's a story of dramatic change. In many cases, it's a story of your own families. It's important to realize the starting point. At the time of the American Revolution, and just after, I think Boston had one of the most homogeneous populations anywhere in the nation. Bostonians, by and large, traced their ancestors not just to England, but to the same small handful of counties in England, leaving a very homogeneous population. Newcomers indeed came in the early years of the Republic, but the pace was slow. In the 1820s, perhaps 2,000 people came through the port of Boston every year, that on a population of the city of about 50,000, and so they were easily absorbed. 25 years later, new arrivals coming through Boston numbered 100,000 per year, a dramatic increase. You know the reasons: famine in Ireland, political turmoil in Germany, and elsewhere. But the point is, it was the pace of this immigration that alarmed the native-born. And you can read that alarm from the 1840s and afterwards. You can read that alarm in the way they talked about it. Immigrants were a flood, a tidal wave, hardly metaphors of welcome. My context number two is that of Jesuit education in the United States. The Jesuit order, founded in the 16th century, had come to Maryland early in English settlement there, with education as their mission. Georgetown University, founded in 1789, run by Jesuits, was the first of their many schools in the United States. And by the 1840s, there were half a dozen Jesuit colleges, including Holy Cross, just about 40 miles down the road in Worcester. And so the question for anyone thinking of a Jesuit college in Boston was, well, why do we need another, especially with a Jesuit college so close? The answer to people at the time, I think, was obvious. For most immigrants and their families, those colleges were, for the most part, out of reach. Holy Cross was a boarding school and cost $150 per year. Don't tell parents today that that's what tuition was then. But at a time when a common laborer made $1 a day if he was lucky, that cost might just as well have been $1 million a year. What was needed instead, our founder said, was a day college for the youth of the city, a college of hours, he called it. In a letter to a Jesuit superior, he wrote, "In Boston, we have at least 2,000 Catholic boys, and as much as I know, there is not one of them at Holy Cross." That demonstrated to him the necessity for another college here, a college in the city, one that would be accessible to people in the city. That man that I'm speaking of was our founder, Father John McElroy. And fittingly enough, he was himself an immigrant. He was born in Enniskillen in the province of Ulster in 1782. And at the age of 20, he followed an emigrant brother to America, settling in Washington, D.C. In old age, Father McElroy used to tell stories of his frequent encounters with President Jefferson on the street. He made it sound as though Jefferson would stop him on the street and ask for advice. I suspect those are just the stories of an old man. But he came under the influence of the Jesuits at Georgetown, and McElroy entered the Society of Jesus, went through a truncated program of study, and was ordained a priest. He was 35 years old at the time, a little older than usual, and I point that out because his age would continue to be a noticeable dimension of his career. Now, in the 1830s, Catholic priests were in short supply nearly everywhere in America, and McElroy had a typically varied ministry. He supervised parishes in Washington, D.C. and Maryland. He opened schools for both boys and girls. He was a chaplain to the American Army during the Mexican War, overseeing a hospital at Matamoros. And in 1847, he came to Boston to become the pastor of one of the busiest parishes in the city, an immigrant parish in the North End neighborhood. There, he got the first idea for this day college for the youth of the city, as he called it, the institution that would become Boston College. When he first got the idea, he was already 65 years old. When he began working on the project in earnest, he was 73. And when those plans were finally realized, he was 81. At a time when most of us are thinking about easing off, McElroy was just getting going. His ideas for the school were clear, but at the very beginning, his timing was poor. He tried to buy a site for the school in downtown Boston, but he was blocked by the city council, temporarily dominated by anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant know-nothings. In fact, they did him a favor. If he had bought that site, it would have been too small for the school on the day it opened. So instead, McElroy purchased land in the south end of the city, a neighborhood that was just opening up, largely on land that was being reclaimed from the harbor. The South End was quickly becoming immigrant central in Boston, with immigrants from Ireland and Germany and elsewhere crowding in. Population density was higher there than in any other neighborhood of the city, and so it was the perfect place for a school designed to serve that immigrant community. So McElroy built a church, the Church of the Immaculate Conception, and next to it a school building. And in 1863, he received a charter for the school from the state. The governor actually signed the bill creating the institution on April 1st, so we can't celebrate April 1st as Founders' Day for perhaps obvious reasons. That was in 1863, and a year later, the doors opened to students for the first time. As I said, McElroy was 81 years old at the time. His work done here, he left Boston for other ministries in and around Washington, eventually dying in 1877, just a couple of weeks after our first graduation, dying there at the age of 95. Just thinking about McElroy makes me tired. On September the 5th, 1864, the first students were admitted to the college. 22, all boys at the time, showed up on the first day, and our dean, another Jesuit named Fulton, noted only one or two had talent. By the end of that school year, about 60 students had attended classes for a longer or shorter period of time. There was a great deal of fluidity in the student body during this period. The complete academic program wouldn't be in place for another decade. And so students came, got a little education, got enough to venture out into the workforce, and then left. It wasn't until 1877 that we could say that the full academic program was in place and that a student therefore had completed it in order to grant a degree. And so in 1877 we had our first graduation, at which time 12 students received their diplomas. The academic program here was based on the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum, the plan of studies that put a heavy emphasis on the classics, Latin and Greek, and on literature. Only occasionally was there a so-called practical course like bookkeeping offered. If pursued from start to finish, this program covered 7 years rather than the now traditional 4, though, as I've said, very few students stayed for all 7 years. From the first, we were called a college, but this was not really higher education as we think of it today. It was more like a high school, or even, in some respects, a contemporary middle school. Of the 22 pioneering students on the very first day, one was only 7 years old. And in the early 1870s, more than half the students were always younger than age 15. So called a college, but think of it in these years as more of a high school. Many of these lads were themselves immigrants who had come to the United States with their parents. Again, mostly from Ireland and Germany, though that would broaden ethnically later on. Among the students in that first academic year, there was Hermann Chilius, born in Germany, his father a music teacher. Hermann himself would become a musician and music teacher. There were the Halloran brothers, John and Timothy, and Michael McCann, all of them born in Ireland. There was Hugh Roe O'Donnell, also born in Ireland, who later became a prominent Boston Catholic pastor. For purposes of counting the immigrants in this early group, I won't count 2 brothers who had been born in Maryland and another boy who had been born in Pennsylvania. There were Bostonians at the time and since who would have considered them immigrants too, but not in our usual meaning of the term. Even more important than students who were immigrants themselves were those who were the sons of immigrants. Besides those I've mentioned of the first year, 2/3 of the student body were children who had been born here, but who were the sons of parents both of whom had been born abroad. And for most of the rest of them, either a mother or a father had been born abroad. So we were very much a part of the progress of the second generation. Those families were, for the most part, solidly rooted in the working class. And so what was in it for them in sending their sons to Boston College couldn't have been clearer. Education was to be their entree to a better life in the next generation. 2 examples. One of the first graduates of the college was a man named Edward McLaughlin. His father was an immigrant and a laborer his entire working life. Young Edward became a lawyer. He was the clerk of the State House of Representatives. He was the president of several civic and charitable organizations. A second example, my old friend William O'Connell, the youngest of 11 children, half of whom had been born in Ireland before the family immigrated. His father and all his brothers worked in the mills of Lowell. But Will, who was a member of the class of 1881, became a priest and a cardinal and served as the Archbishop of Boston throughout the first half of the 20th century. I say we're all friends because he was the subject of my dissertation, although he was safely dead by the time I was born. I feel I know him. In any event, that was the kind of progress across the generations that families wanted, and Boston College was helping them get it. Now, in fact, some families of students had already begun to move up before their children came to Boston College. And the best example of that are the McAvoys. Daniel McAvoy was student number 1. His name is the first name on the list of students from 1864. Daniel Murphy Chrysostom McAvoy, if you please. Eventually, 3 McAvoy brothers attended, none staying long enough to graduate Immigrant parents, both of them born in Ireland, but the father here had become a successful iron merchant, and the family lived in progressively better houses, eventually one on Brattle Street in Cambridge. They had domestic servants. The boys who attended Boston College subsequently became a businessman, a reporter, and a Jesuit. And so families like theirs were cementing their place in the middle class rather than achieving it for the first time. Either way, over the generations, families like all of these gradually put the immigrant experience behind them. It became a memory that might need to be recovered for them. And that in itself was made possible, I think, at least in part, by the boost that they got from the college. Now, as I said at the outset, many of the early faculty continued to be immigrants as well, just as Father McElroy had. The faculty was almost entirely Jesuits in the early years, and throughout the 19th century, Jesuits were regularly getting expelled from one European country after another. They came to the U.S. where they fueled the rapidly expanding system of Jesuit colleges. The best example, I think, of that influx of immigrant Jesuits is our first president, who took over the school after McElroy had established it. He was John Bapst, born in the canton of Fribourg in Switzerland. He was educated in Jesuit colleges there and joined the order as a young man, ordained in 1846, just in time to get expelled from Switzerland with all the other Jesuits in the country. He came with his colleagues to the United States, where he was given a difficult assignment, that of ministering to settlements in Maine of Catholic Indians who had been converted by missionaries from Quebec 2 centuries before. Bapst, who was a native French speaker, faced the daunting task in Maine of learning both English and Penobscot at the same time. Try it. He met tragedy in Maine, however, at the hands of know-nothings, more violent than that which McElroy had faced in Boston. In 1854, while serving in a church in Ellsworth, Maine, Bapst was seized by a mob one Saturday night and paraded through town on a sharp rail. Then he was stripped of his clothes, tarred and feathered, before being saved by some local Catholic men. One account, possibly apocryphal, says that he said Mass the next morning just as usual. That was the background he had before coming to Boston College as president in 1864, serving until 1869. Other immigrant Jesuits on the faculty didn't face the same harrowing experience, but their numbers in the early years helped to preserve the connection of the college to the students they were serving. In many of our classrooms, there were immigrants on both sides of the desk. Well, time doesn't permit a detailed review of the later years. You have to keep an eye on historians, after all. They'll just keep talking if you let them until we get to the day before yesterday. But I did want to give you some sense of the beginnings of our present university and where it came from. Some landmarks in the subsequent development was starting with the clear separation of the high school and college curriculum at the beginning of the 20th century. As I said at the beginning, it really was kind of an overgrown high school. At the beginning of the 20th century, the college and the college and secondary programs were separated, creating thereby this distinct institution of Boston College High School, which still exists and which is also celebrating its 150th anniversary this year. Then there was the move of the college division here to Chestnut Hill in 1915 and the beginning of the building up of this campus. The establishment of graduate and professional programs throughout the first half of the 20th century, so that today we have, in addition to undergraduate and graduate arts and sciences, business, law, nursing, education, social work, and theology. And lastly, an expansion of the university in the 1960s and 70s, including the decision to become completely coeducational. All of that progress means, I think, that like many immigrant stories, perhaps, ours is one of both light and shadow. On its face, all our successes have been welcome. They are, in a sense, just what everyone involved with the university wanted over the years: fulfillment of the desire to climb the ladders of success over generations that had brought immigrants here in the first place. At the same time, this presents the danger that our very success will distance us from our immigrant experience. We do not know how many immigrants are students at Boston College today. We don't gather that information for perhaps obvious reasons. But like other Jesuit schools, we have to find ways to sustain that commitment as we can. Many of you may have read of the recent study based at Fairfield, our sister university in Connecticut, to define the ways in which Jesuit colleges across the country should help continue their service to the immigrant community. Whatever that yields, this college for the boys of the city would in many ways not be recognizable to our first immigrant students and our first immigrant faculty. But their commitments, I think, are and should be both our past and our future. Thanks. Did I say at the beginning you had to know this for the final?
There's a question here.
Oh.
I'm just curious about the trajectory of training for the priesthood at Boston College.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed like it was a major trajectory in the beginning. How is that?
Right. The question was the trajectory of training for the priesthood among students of Boston College and how that's changed over the years. If you look at the early alumni, and for the first 25 years or so, graduating classes number somewhere between a dozen and 20. Until the 1900, the overwhelming majority of those graduates do subsequently go on to seminary studies and to the priesthood. So just in terms of numbers, in the early years, the overwhelming majority of Boston College graduates did indeed become priests, mostly diocesan clergy rather than members of the Jesuit order. But one of the things that I don't know if McElroy himself said it, but it was in the first advertisement for Boston College in the Boston newspapers, pointed out that that was a possible career path for students who had graduated here. But the ad said, we need not only priests, we need men of every profession, doctors, lawyers, merchants, and so on. And so while the balance was tipped very heavily in the direction of the clergy in the very early years, by 1900 that balance had started to shift. In the early years, it surprised me, more of our graduates went on to become doctors than lawyers. Of course, both medicine and law and the educational requirements for them are kind of fluid at the time. So training for the priesthood, sustaining the Catholic community was certainly something that was important to our founders, but it was not the only purpose of the institution. They wanted people of these other professions as well. So there's somebody in the...
Thank you very much, Jim. That was terrific. Could you say a bit more or something about the evolution of the relationship between the university and the archdiocese?
I probably could. Though a Catholic institution, Boston College has always been organizationally, legally distinct from the archdiocese. Obviously, in the greater Boston area at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, Boston is one of the most Catholic cities in the country. I think for a lot of that period, New York the New York Archdiocese is probably always first, but Boston is pretty much second. So there was that link in serving the same, or intending to serve the same communities. At the same time, because they were organizationally distinct, Boston College and the Archdiocese could go in different directions. At the time of the move to here to Chestnut Hill, by that time Cardinal O'Connell was the Archbishop. And as a part of the move, Cardinal O'Connell wanted to reorganize Boston College so that the Jesuits were no longer in charge of it, but that, guess who, he would be in charge of it instead. And our president at the time, Father Thomas Gasson, was really very artful in dodging that attempt. O'Connell wrote to him and said, well, of course, you're a completely different institution now. You're not a high school. You really are going to be a university. And as such, you should agree to this new arrangement. And he pointed to a document from the Vatican that seemed to support the Cardinal's position. Gasson thanked the Cardinal for his letter. Oh, we're going to study this very carefully. And finally wrote back about 6 months later saying, well, we really couldn't sign a document to that effect because if we did, that would imply that there were a different way of reading that Roman document than what you suggest, Your Eminence. And of course, we wouldn't want to imply that. So please excuse us from essentially signing the university over. I think Cardinal O'Connell simply gave up at that point. So there has been that connection in terms of graduates and the priesthood. In the early years of the 20th century, it was common for for a young man intending to go into the priesthood to come to Boston College for a couple of years and then leave before graduating and entering the seminary, which is located just across Commonwealth Avenue here. Anyone who did that was still considered a member of the class he would have graduated with and was active in alumni affairs in that way. So the relationship continued. And then the last chapter in that story, of course, is the now 6 or 7 years ago when Boston College purchased the property of the Archdiocesan Seminary and the Cardinal's residence across the street, and now have expanded into what we call our Brighton campus, the home of our School of Theology and Ministry and other programs. So it's been a close relationship. It's had its ups and downs. The university, I would say, has profited from the relationship on the whole. Here, wait for a microphone.
Oh, how cool. Hello. I wanted to thank you for the presentation because I go to school here. I'm a first-year doc student, and I didn't know whom the buildings were named after, so that was really neat. My question is, I really appreciated your attention to the beginning of BC, focus on recruitment and retention related to the immigrant experience. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to the recent past and the present on where you think we stand now. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a couple of very significant trends appear, I think, in the 1960s and afterwards. The first is the decision that I alluded to, the decision for Boston College to become completely co-educational. We were at the outset and in the early years for males only. That was very common among Jesuit schools. It was common in Catholic higher education generally. There were separate leagues of schools for men and women. Women were admitted to the graduate and professional schools by and large as they were established 1920 on, but the undergraduate programs were still all male. until the establishment of the School of Nursing and the School of Education in the 1940s, women were still excluded from arts and sciences and the business school. I think obviously reflecting what were not uncommon societal expectations about what women could and should do, especially with a degree. In the 1960s, with the collusion of a couple of Jesuit deans, there was a cohort of women. I've interviewed some of these women. There were women who were admitted to the education school, which was coeducational, and then they were kind of backdoored into the College of Arts and Sciences. This was technically against the rules of the Jesuit order, but there was a bit of a breach in that wall in that way. In the fall of 1970, undergraduate arts and sciences, undergraduate business became fully coeducational, with the result that then all the schools of the university were coeducational. And I saw some data the other day. The current student body at Boston College is, I think, 53% female, 52, 53. So women are now, in fact, a majority of the students. And I believe a couple of years ago, women became a majority in the Alumni Association as well, as the generation went on. Also in the 1960s were the first serious efforts to attract African American students. And there were a number of programs that were established at that time to attract students who previously would not themselves have thought about coming to Boston College. They would have thought that it was a school just for the local Catholic community in particular. Many African Americans, of course, are Catholic as well. But those racial barriers began to be breached as well. And today, I should know these numbers. I think the incoming class of undergraduates this year was 23%. We have a category called AHANA, African American, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, and so on. I think 23 or maybe 24% of the incoming class was classified in that way, which was an all-time high. So these are obviously long-term processes. And there again, I think are aspects that would make the university today not so recognizable to the founders, and yet times change and institutions change with them.
The absence of a school of medicine here at Boston College, and I'm wondering, with the numerous Catholic hospitals, or former, at least originally Catholic hospitals in Boston, what's behind that?
Yeah, the question is about the absence of a school of medicine here. At the time of the move from the South End here to Chestnut Hill in 1913, under Father Gasson wanted a medical school. He wanted to open a medical school right then. And actually it was Cardinal O'Connell who put the brakes on that, which perhaps was a good thing. Since then, I've seen no evidence that we ever considered subsequently opening a medical school. There are many Jesuit universities that have medical schools, Georgetown, Creighton, and others. So it's not, it's not out of the question, wouldn't have been out of the question as far as Jesuits were concerned. But as I say, I've never seen any subsequent discussion of the idea of a medical school. There certainly is a concentration of hospitals in the greater Boston area, but I have to think that if the subject ever came up, the sense would have been, well, there are lots of medical schools in Boston as well. So,
I guess I was thinking in terms of the segregation by religion of hospitals around the United States and in Boston, whether the hospitals were started by Jews, Catholics, or Protestants, and needing to feed them with residents from those, groups of people.
yeah, there may have been those kinds of discussions. I haven't seen evidence of them. Certainly, there was the establishment and growth of a distinct Catholic hospital system in the greater Boston area. The issue did come up in the 1940s with the establishment of our School of Nursing. And I think I can say, I've said this to the current dean of the School of Nursing, when this idea was put forward in 1947, no one at Boston College wanted to open a nursing school. It was the idea of Cardinal Cushing, O'Connell's successor, who was the Archbishop of Boston, who very much pushed for the establishment of a school of nursing. Here there's a wonderful letter from our president at the time to his Jesuit superiors saying, he's just not going to take no for an answer. We just have to do this, and he wants us to do it in 2 years. They did quite successfully. But in any event, that's the story of a medical school. The other school, professional school that we don't have that other Jesuit universities do, there's never really any serious consideration of an engineering school here either. There was a brief flurry of interest in the 1950s of a journalism school, but that didn't happen either. So I think it's probably true of many universities around the country that what professional programs they have, what professional schools they have, are really in response to particular circumstances. Certainly there was no master plan here for the establishment of professional schools, and as I say, I suspect in the majority of universities across the country that was the case as well.
I want to follow up to the previous question and ask, you alluded to the study at Fairfield University, which I'm not sure if I have the same study in mind, but as I understand it, they collaborated with several other Jesuit universities to look at possible positionings of Jesuit universities vis-a-vis, in particular, undocumented migrants, both in terms of a more public statement about access to university education, and then in what I thought was a very interesting innovation, how to accompany graduates after they finish their education. So I'm wondering if you can comment on how you might envision or speculate about how Boston College might situate itself vis-a-vis these innovations at other Jesuit universities in terms of our history.
Yeah, this is in a way the latest news. This report was just issued a couple of weeks ago. I think I've looked at some of the data online. I've read the executive summary, and there is a very detailed list of proposals that they make. That would ensure access to Jesuit universities, with particular reference, perhaps, to the undocumented. Things that, left to myself, I wouldn't necessarily have thought about on the application that a student files to come to Boston College. Do you require them to put in a Social Security number? And is that a required field? Well, for someone without a Social Security number, that's a problem. What do you do about financial aid and so on? So I think this discussion going forward is important because it's a way of connecting Jesuit universities in the present and future with what really their roots are. If you look at Jesuit education, higher education across the country, the other schools have had our same successes. They're prosperous. They attract large numbers of students, larger numbers of applicants. And that's great. The danger is that they become schools only for people who already have the resources. They reinforce inequality in American higher education rather than challenge it, as they did certainly at the beginning. So I think that helps set the agenda for discussion in the future. Beyond that, I won't say historians are always happier in the past than they are in the future, and sometimes the present, actually, as well. But that's another.
Just why did Cardinal O'Connell wish to gain control, in a sense, of Boston College when it moved to Chestnut Hill? Thank you.
Well, we better talk afterwards. Cardinal O'Connell sought to control most aspects of Catholic life in Boston. From his perspective, it was a not unlikely position. He was the Archbishop. He was the most visible Catholic leader in the greater Boston area. Achieved tremendous successes during his tenure on his own. The number of parishes in the Archdiocese nearly doubled during Cardinal O'Connell's tenure, and in particular, there was the growth in his tenure of what were called national parishes, that is to say, parishes not serving a particular territory, but a particular language or ethnic or national group. So he rightly saw himself as the one to promote that, and insofar as Boston College was a Catholic institution, he was interested in that. I think he was probably also, I will say, interested in perhaps fundraising competition. You know, he's asking people for money to support that growth of the church. Boston College is asking people for money. In some cases, it's the same people. So mixed motives, as always, in human affairs.
How did the local community react to the election of the Jesuit Pope? How did the local community react to the
just last week
election?
Well, from the Jesuits I've talked to here, there's satisfaction with this. There was a little flurry as the conclave was going on, as you may have seen in the press, that it was going to be Cardinal O'Malley of Boston who was elected Pope. And local pride aside, I myself thought that would not be a good thing. Cardinal O'Malley is, of course, a Franciscan, and the last Franciscan Pope, Clement XIV, I believe, was the Pope who in the 1770s suppressed the Jesuit order. So I think it was probably perhaps good that didn't happen. The only other thing I'd say, the day after the election of Cardinal Bergoglio as Pope Francis, I happened to go to Mass in the chapel, the student chapel on campus, and there's a point in the Catholic Mass where the priest asks for prayers specifically for the Pope. And before the Mass, the priest, a member of the Jesuit community here, said that he hoped that when he got to that point in the Mass, he said the right name and was not just repeating the name that he'd been, Benedict, that he'd been saying for the last several years. And when he did get to that point in the Mass, he said, and I forget exactly what the words are, we pray for our Pope Francis, S.J. And I thought, well, that's maybe how the Mass is going to be celebrated here at Boston College going forward. We'll see how that turns out.